Munich. I'm very happy to welcome you to our new panel. And let's say it's a talk about challenges for young international producers. And it's a pleasure to introduce the two hosts. First of all, it's Frank Doelger. Just for you, but I think you know him. He's a producer, an executive producer. He's also a showrunner, a director, and lately he is the artistic director of Intaglio Films. The other host that we'll have via Zoom, hello, to Jan. Hi, Jan. Is Jan Wünschmann from Beta Cinema. He is in the management of Beta Cinema and also heading the co-productions department. So a very warm welcome to Frank Doelger and Jan Wünschmann.
Hi, Jan.
Hi, Frank. Hi.
Hi.
I can't hear you, but I can hear you.
That's fine. We see each other enough, so I think as long as our voices carry, we'll be fine. Yes. So the subject is international co-production. I think for the purpose of this talk, we should decide on what the definition of international is, because I'm sure all of you is aware that definition changes every few years. It's still changing, and depending on who you ask, it's a very different definition. For me, I think at this point, it's very simple to distinguish between two types of international production. There are projects that are made that are not intended to become, that are not international, that suddenly become international. Squid Game is one of the current examples. Previously, Game of Thrones, which I produced, was another example. Those shows suddenly just are not intended to do anything but satisfy the audience for which they're made. And in one case, it was a South Korean broadcaster. Game of Thrones was HBO, and they become something else. The other type of international projects are the ones that you go in hoping will be international. At one point, that was defined pretty much by casting. You would have a show which was very specific to a location, and you thought that if you got an international cast, it suddenly became international. And that certainly made it possible in terms of selling it. I think that that model is very outdated now, and that's not really the way you proceed. Also, I think international, at least on this side of the Atlantic, was defined by European. And I think international now is much broader than that. It's truly international. So, and again, I think we're going to take you through an example of one of the projects we did to let you know about all the challenges that we face putting it together, both creatively and financially. But again, I think the thing that we always decide on our projects is what the intention is. Because again, you can get very lucky with a project that you're making simply for one of a local broadcaster, a local streamer, and it will surprise you. And that can be a very different financing model and a very different creative model, or you can go out and try to make something for the international market. Both are equally risky. There's no guarantee that a show that's made for a local market, no matter how well it's received locally, will travel. And I'm sure anybody who watches any of the streaming service will see literally hundreds of shows that they're hoping to reach an international audience, which are available internationally, but no one watches. And those can be very risky because you can spend a lot of money on those projects and you never recoup. So I hope that for the purposes of this conversation, I really want to talk about the shows that we're doing that we have defined as international. And when I started the company, and Jan joined and has been helping along with this, for me, international was completely defined by the subject matter. Very early on in my career, when I was working first for HBO, I had a very interesting meeting where the head of HBO saw a small show that I had done, and he called me in, and he was very pleased because that morning in the New York Times, there's an editorial by someone who writes on political issues, and it was a story about a racial incident that happened in a small town in New Jersey. But the fact that it was not a review, it got good reviews, but the fact that a journalist from the New York Times was writing an article about this show for a political audience addressed to people in Washington, he said to me, to get off the entertainment pages is what a service like HBO has to do. You have to get shows that actually people will talk about, and those are always defined by topics, I think, and themes. So one of the things that we've decided is that every project we do, in terms of our definition of international, is completely based on subject matter. Clearly, once you make that decision, there are a lot of other decisions that need to follow in terms of how you're financing and how you put it together. So that is, I think that's the broad definition that I would use for the purpose of today, and I think it's a good one for everybody to keep in mind as you're going forward, either producing, writing, or directing, is which of those two definitions of international projects is going to define your vision and the show you want to do. And I think, Jan, you might want to speak a little about the financing of those two different models and some of the challenges that we have faced before we go into the specific example of the Swarm.
Maybe a few short comments on this, because like we have this challenge when we try to produce these big shows, doing something different out of a German-based company called Intalio, founded by two German companies, Head of Enterprise and Beta, and trying to find a, let's say, very unique international tonality and what it looks like, but being confronted with a financing model based in the European, let's say, European model, versus what is the European versus, let's say, the UK, US, and in between a little bit the international streamers. And since the company, and maybe we talk about it a little later, is founded, as I said, by two distribution companies, our aim is always to finance it in a, let's say, very rights-friendly way, because we believe in it that it's for different reasons, we will touch later as well, maybe a good model for the producer to keep rights, to keep the IP, to keep the identity of the project, and to make sure that it can travel later on basically everywhere, and not being in the hand of the streamer deciding where it is shown and not. And but like saying that building is financing not through a streamer, through the European landscape by putting different linear channels together, just touching it, it's like a very challenging and sometimes time-consuming task, and it is a completely different model if you talk about the size of the funds we have and the means, than when we talk about the big studio productions. Frank knows what I'm talking about because he has been working on both sides, being confronted with, let's say, difficult or sometimes with certain limits, which we are confronted in the European landscape, but still like trying to do the best possible out of Europe for a global market. But this less means than we have in the UK and US, where the budgets are usually much higher. And we all grew up with US shows, and it's in our cultural, I would say, heritage in the Western European world. But we are trying it in a different world, different way. And this is like when Frank is talking about what is international, and it's defined by subject matter creatively, and that should be the starting point. But there is also how it is financed, and there I would say, what we say it's international, it is financed through a European model by putting together different international partners, not just European. We get to that in a second on Swarm, that we're not just European partners, but usually like in a different way than just working with big studios and money from the US and the UK.
Yes, Jan touched on a very important point. I had the luxury for 20 years of going to a place like HBO, saying what I wanted to do, and they would hand me a check. The check they never gave you was big enough, but we played the game, but they financed it fully, they owned everything. So for a producer, it can be very attractive because you have all the money you need. You have one group of creative executives to whom you have to answer, and you are spared what takes up a lot of time is trying to find the money to get projects financed and whittling away budgets. The downside is that you don't own anything, either individually or certainly as a company. So, and that's an increasingly less attractive model, I think, in the world where projects can travel and they're so valuable. But it's been a little bit of a learning curve for me, because not only did we have to go through the sort of financial budgeting considerations and conversations, you're also in a very tricky position, because if you have 4 or 5 different broadcasters who are paying a lot of money by their standards for a show, you will have 5 sets of notes from different executives at different companies, and most of the companies with whom you deal could have 3 or 4 different executives. So you can find yourself getting dozens of pages of notes, a lot of times which are contradictory to one another. You also have to be very careful that you don't lose sight of what you wanted to do, what attracted you to the project originally, because you could find yourself departing from your vision and watering it down to keep all of the partners happy. And that is very, very much a challenge, and it's an incredibly difficult challenge for young producers. Without a track record, you're going up against a lot of executives who have more experience than you will have. With a track record, you arguably have more experience than they do. But even then, it is tricky territory, and you can lose projects that way. You lose sight of what really attracted it to you and how you wanted to do it. And even if you get through the scripting process, you then have the casting process, which also is very complicated, because again, you're trying to cast a project in the way that you think it's best. At the same time, even if you define the subject matter as the reason for doing it and saying it's international, there will always be pressure on you to find actors from the countries that are the companies in the countries which are supporting it. They'll be sending their suggestions for actors, and you then have another set of notes coming in when you're editing. You will be sending out cuts, and you will be getting notes again from a lot of different broadcasters. So it's not an easy road, but I think it can be a very creatively satisfying one, and ultimately a profitable one, profitable enough at least to sort of earn a living at it. But again, you shouldn't have any illusions about, once you actually start down this path, how tricky it's going to be. So it does take a strength of vision and a commitment to really fight for what you believe is best for the project, and to try to make as few compromises as possible. And again, I think we're going to take you through this project called The Swarm, and we can let you know all the steps that we took to end up there.
Frank, maybe one comment to what you just said, because we saw it on The Swarm, and there for you, especially for you, it was a tremendous challenge, to collect all these notes and dealing with them. Sometimes they were contradictory, and from our perspective, when we, for example, within Beta, setting up a co-production, very often asked by US partners coming on board and bringing in European money, and taking that position, we always try to give a commitment, because for partners usually it's not attractive to have 5 partners on board giving notes, because it's just a very different way to do it. You usually try to give a commitment to channel all these notes. So if we bring in, let's say, 3 European partners, all notes are usually brought in to us. That is sometimes different in the entire project, because it's a different setup. But even there, actually our aim or idea was maybe that the biggest financier, the biggest partner, is maybe the lead partners collecting the notes. But saying that, in reality, it's very different and very difficult, and it doesn't always work that way. But that, because Frank said, as a young producer, being confronted with these challenges, that definitely would be one comment to try to set it up that way, that you have a lead partner who's bringing in all notes channeled. And the other one, the other comment I wanted to say it could be also be a beauty having different partners because it gives a lot of authenticity to the project. Like if you have different, from the creative point of view, different storylines and supported by local partners, they usually know very well what things have to look like, how people in their country and from their origin, how they speak, and this, at least what we see, can be a very like an advantage to a project as well, compared to if you produce it through a streamer, where you don't get all these notes from the cultural backgrounds. Yeah?
No, there are definitely advantages. Certainly, sometimes it opens up the casting in a way that you hadn't thought of. Sometimes storylines develop. But, so I think at this point, it might be helpful to talk to you about the first project, which is the new model that we put in place. There is one of the first projects that was brought to me and brought to Intaglio was a novel called The Swarm by Frank Schätzing. The Swarm was written in 2004 or 5. It was an international sensation when it came out. The film rights were bought immediately. It was in development for 12 years, 13 years with every studio on both sides of the Atlantic. Directors, writers, talent came and went. And ultimately, it died. They could never come up with a screenplay, they could never come up with an approach to make the project work. And the reason for that, in my opinion, is that the story is very simply, for those of you who don't know, there are a group of scientists around the world who begin to perceive odd things happening always along the coastlines of the world. There's suddenly swarms of jellyfish attacking Venice. There are whales attacking boats. There are poisoned seafood, which are exploding in restaurants. And the poisons they have are getting into the water system. There are odd currents developing throughout the North Atlantic, which are changing the Gulf Stream. And this group of scientists begin to realize these are all events that have been happening individually, but they begin to realize these aren't random, that there's something that's uniting all these, something, and they begin to speculate what could be causing this. And, is it nuclear waste? Is it a foreign power wanting to disrupt shipping? And they go through all the scenarios. And they finally decide that actually the only explanation is that there's an intelligent life force living in the ocean that's been there all the time. And this intelligent life force has decided that given all the damage that we've been doing to the oceans, if they don't kill us, we are going to destroy life in the seas. So they decide to attack and take revenge upon us. And everything they do to attack men is exactly what we've been doing to the seas. So the problem with the novel, if you reduce it to 90-minute, it becomes a disaster movie. You take an 800-page novel, which has very interesting sections about science and marine biology, and it becomes and I've read some of those screenplays, and it's nothing but a group of people running around trying to kill a monster. So, which clearly they never quite got right, because actually there are just too many films out there like that. And what was special about the novel? So it was brought to us, and we were asked if we would consider it for an 8-part series to be financed by ZAF and some other partners. We said yes. There are many times when we regretted that decision over the last 3 years, but we then, yes, we decided to take it on. And one of the reasons the first question everybody asked, could you possibly afford to do this on the budget that we knew we would have? I think at one point I realized that our budget was probably what 2 episodes of Game of Thrones cost in the last season. So we were trying to do 8 hours of standard that was very, very difficult. A couple of things made it possible, one of which is the enormous advance in visual effects. There were things that we could do on The Swarm that were completely impossible. 7 or 8 or 9 years ago when we were doing Thrones. And also, I think that everybody realized that this was a very special project, so we could fight hard to get a bit more money. Having said that, Jan and people with whom he works then went out to get it financed. And it was financed off the idea and the pitch, and we very rapidly got partners to come in. ZDF came in, France Télévisions came in, RAI came in, NENT, which is a group of Scandinavian broadcasters, came in, and then, much to our surprise, Hulu Japan came in, which was unexpected. But again, if Japan is a seafaring nation, every resource comes, and the seas are incredibly important to it. But it was very much a topic that struck everybody's, they thought was topical and also struck their imagination. But the first thing we had to do is, faced with the budget limitations and faced with the world we wanted to create, we had to make two very essential choices. Tonally, what was the picture? Was it a monster movie, because there was a monster, or was it something else? So we actually decided it was something else. The monster in the film actually turns out to be man. So when we started with that, we realized that the best way to do it was to take the inspiration from what Steven Spielberg did so brilliantly in Jaws when he had no money, was to save it to the very last few minutes when you actually saw the shark. So we decided, for dramatic and creative reasons and budgetary reasons, it wouldn't be until the very last few frames of the series that we would see this monster. But how do you do a monster movie without a monster? So the second decision we made was, well, the monster was in the water. And so we decided that as long we wanted to shoot always by the water, so even though you weren't seeing the monster was always in the next room. And that actually turned out, those were two decisions I think we made, honestly, for financial reasons, that creatively had enormous benefits. It also allowed us to spend, the other decision we made was, we thought it was very unlikely we could attract big names. We didn't have the kind of money that you can pay very, very well-established actors, unless there are people who love the project. In the novel, there are 5 or 6 of the main characters are all world-class scientists. Actually, it's a bunch of old white men. And we thought that was pretty uninteresting. So we decided that these world-class scientists were all going to be most of them are going to be graduate students, PhD candidates in marine biology. We took several of the parts and we made them female. And one of the things that was really fascinating to me, when the novel was written, it was, if you asked anybody in the scientific community, how many people from minorities go into the scientist? And it was an incredibly low percentage. And in 2020, 16 years later, if you looked at the makeup of people in the scientists in graduate schools, it had changed enormously. So we decided also to make the cast much more racially diverse, ethnically diverse. We also introduced characters of different sexual orientation. So what came out of that decision to not go after big names, with 1 or 2 exceptions who love the project, we ended up with a much more interesting casting approach. So what I wanted to say is that these types of impediments can sometimes lead, I think, to very, very creative and suggestive, surprising solutions. Do you want to comment on that part before I go on to the next bit?
Maybe only a short one, like making the bridge to the comment before, because this decision, especially to the cast, what you just said, like having maybe not the most established cast in the world due to different reasons, creatively and for the budget, was a big discussion with our partners. Like, because Wünschmann is putting a lot of money in a project, big names are sort of security as well. And so you need a strong, let's say, you need a strong vision and a lot of maybe experience and a strong person running it and defending that idea. And we had a lot of discussions, whom to bring in and to trust us on all these sort of how to put it together creatively as well. And in the end, I think everyone is very happy, but it wasn't an easy run, always on the way. Yeah.
I have to tell you about one extraordinary moment. So at the beginning of every series, if you can, like a film, you get the entire cast together to read through. And so we wanted to spend over a weekend reading through all 8 episodes. This was in February when people couldn't travel. So we had a Zoom reading. And no one in the cast, I think there must have been 18 or 19 people participating, and no one in the cast knew who else had been cast. And without exception, I got a call from everybody afterwards saying they were so stunned and thrilled, sitting there looking at 19 pictures of actors from different backgrounds, different races, ethnicity, sexual orientation, ages. That's never happened in any of their careers. They've never had an experience when you started off a picture which actually truly reflected the world in which we live or want to live. So again, I think that was a wonderful moment when it just meant that even on that side of things, we were doing something right. We got a bit of a surprise when the Japanese came in because we were pretty far along, and then Japan Hulu read the material, loved it, and made an incredibly generous offer for certain rights. We had no Japanese storyline. They felt very strongly there needed to be a Japanese storyline. There was in the novel, actually I won't comment what there was in the novel, but there was something in the novel that was roughly in this territory that we cut out. But much to the dismay of our writers, who had been through about 10 drafts at this point, we said, okay, now we need a Japanese storyline. 3 writers left the project. They then came back. And it actually, what was interesting about it is that without that, it was international because basically it was European with some characters from Canada. And by introducing this Japanese storyline, we were able to get 3 extraordinary actors, and actually the whole thing suddenly became truly international. The other great, the other thing that was nice about the casting is that there was a part for a First Nation, a Canadian First Nation with the Native Americans and North Americans in Canada. And we felt very strongly about trying to find someone from that community. And I think our casting directors, we auditioned 60 or 70 people. I mean, acting is not something that First Nation people go into. And we found this extraordinary 19-year-old. And we were so thrilled because if we hadn't gotten this actor, we would have had to rewrite the part because we couldn't have someone who wasn't from that community playing that community. So the day we were going to close the deal, we got a call from the casting director saying we have a problem, which is that this young actor had just been offered a 3-picture deal by Paramount, which was remaking the Predator films. So I knew the casting director very well. She happened to know his acting coach, and she tipped me off, and she said, the one thing about this actor is that he's very involved in his local community. He grew up on the reservation. He was involved in teaching native languages. So I called him, and it was actually very funny because suddenly he went from an acting student in a small town in Canada to being on the phone with the head of Paramount, and then he had seen Game of Thrones, so he was a little bit anxious about the call with me. And I promised at the end of the conversation I would answer all of his questions, primarily why the last season was so bad. So that's another topic. But I said to him, just tell me about the part in Predator. He said, well, it's a kid growing up in a reservation. He was abused by his father. His mother committed suicide. He has a drug problem. He has an alcohol problem. So I said, okay, so do you really want your first role to play into every cliche of this community? Is this really what you want your career to be? Is you really want to go out there to reinforce in a big Hollywood film that people from First Nations, or do you want to play a cytologist at an eminent marine biology facility in Vancouver, who basically, with a group of other scientists, saves the world? So all I would say to you is we can't match the money. We can't match the money. We can't probably match everything else, but I would just ask you to think about that. And it worked. So, he'll probably, so I was very pleased about that as well. But sometimes the subject matter also is very key for attracting talent, as you know.
Yeah.
So we did have the Japanese storyline, which worked well.
But Frank, do you want to say a few words about how Hulu very much from the first day on said how important it is to have a Japanese cast, and the process by literally it took us I think 4 months until we got the first meeting with a Japanese actor, and by all this language, English, and in the end and then because it was very much like creatively, you found a way and a solution how to put it in a way that it actually works. I found that a very interesting and funny story because it was financially triggered and actually then creatively solved.
Well, when we were told we had to have a Japanese storyline, I asked our casting directors to draw up a list of Japanese actors. And it was a fantastic list. What I didn't realize is that every Japanese actor that is known here is unheard of in Japan. So the head of Hulu then presented his list of the Japanese actors, none of whom I had heard of, but you had mentioned them to Japanese, and and they were huge stars. The problem is none of them spoke English. So, but again, fortunately, we hadn't made a decision, which is because we wanted this show to be authentic. We decided that when we had French characters together, when we had German characters together, when we had English characters together, Scandinavian characters together, Italian characters, they would speak in their native language. I mean, one of the great advantages we have now, which I'm sure you all know, is the problem with subtitles, the problems with other languages. We've crossed that barrier. It's actually something that's very attractive. When I was doing Game of Thrones, HBO made us shoot all the scenes which were Dothraki in other languages. They said there's no way in the world our audience is going to watch subtitles. We felt very strongly about it, so we did it 2 versions. In the test screenings, people absolutely loved the languages that we invented. So, films like Parasite, all of these have really made people realize that, or broadcasters realize there's an advantage. So we decided that the only way to do this was that I said to the Japanese Hulu executive, I found out who the actor was, and he's a fantastic actor. I was a little bit alarmed to find out that he'd started off in a boy band at 16, and then had gone into soap operas and to movies, but I also saw some commercials he did, a famous campaign, I think, for Pepsi and for Blue Jeans, and he was incredibly magnetic, and his English was execrable. He couldn't speak a word of English. So he did get a coach for 3 or 4 months, and we had the audition, and about every other word was vaguely recognizable. But we were looking at a lot of money. So we simply decided that all of his scenes except one would be in Japanese. That worked out pretty well. And then we got him a coach and a dialogue coach. And by the end, he was actually very magnetic. We cut away to reaction shots a lot when he's speaking. But again, he has something on camera. But again, so none of these challenges, if we had gone to HBO with this or nothing else, we would have had none of these challenges. And I would argue at this point that probably the show we made would probably not have been as interesting or as good. So maybe we'll just. I can't show you. I was hoping to show a clip, but we can't. It's still editing. It's not going to be. It's going to be going out of the Berlinale in 2023. But I just thought I would show you some concepts we put together in terms of selling to this. What we had to do was we had to convince all of the partners that we were going to create a world that was recognizable today, had a great deal of geographic variety. The story takes place in Vancouver and Canada. It takes place near Bordeaux in France. It takes place in Norway, the Arctic Ocean, Peru, Italy, Japan. Am I forgetting any place? Germany, yes, Germany. We shot it all in Italy. We had, there's a brilliant producer named Mark Huffam, who's Ridley Scott's producer, who started off as a location manager. And Mark produced the first season with me of Game of Thrones, and the original plan was to go to South Africa. We just knew we couldn't travel to all those locations. And then with COVID, we decided that there's no way we were going to have actors going back and forth. And he said, you'll find everything you'll need in Italy. None of us believed him. But we did. We went up northern Italy by Veneto. We went down to Puglia. It was actually amazing. But I also remember I did a picture once with Ridley Scott, and we were having the same argument. And I was obsessing over, it was supposed to be in colonial New England, and I said, it doesn't look like that. And he said, if you put it on the screen that it's colonial New England, the audience will believe it. So that was Ridley's approach. So, but we wanted to do a little bit better. So maybe we can just show some images. And these are all concept artists based on the actual locations we found in Italy for the show. So I thought it might just be interesting to show you some of those. Okay, this is a scene that takes place in the beginning of the novel in Peru. A young fisherman goes out and accompanies a swarm of fish. This was about an hour from Rome. We found a beach that had these palm trees. We've added some mountains in the background. It also had a fantastic sky. So, and it's quite a long sequence. And again, I think if anybody saw this, you would never think you were an hour from Rome. I think there's one more. I think there's one more of this one.
Sorry.
Yes. Jan's not on that. Jan's the business side. Technically, he's.
I don't know why it's always jumping two pictures. That's why I have to go one back. Always. Sorry.
So this is what you're seeing in the bottom of the frame in the water. This was shot in a tank in Brussels. There's a fantastic tank in Brussels, which is unlike any other tank because it was built by a cinematographer and a producer. And the cinematographer, actually very unusual for tanks, has designed it so you can light underwater. So we brought in all the rocks, all the foliage, the sand, and thank you. Yes. This is actually an actual location in Veneto, about an hour north of Venice, and this structure exists. We're going to add, in Canada, what's very distinguished, what's very specific about the Pacific coastline, you have these evergreen trees that come right down to the water. This location, if you look at it, had a very sandy beach. So again, we found the structure, and we shot in angles, and we just added through visual effects all of the background trees. But again, the research we found, almost everything in this part of Canada is built with wood. That's the local building material, and you have all of these houses that are built, houseboats, over on the water. This is a scene when they discover an orca that's dead on the beach. This is again a beach in Veneto. Again, this was the sandy beach. We added the trees in the background as well. This is a scene where we do an autopsy on the same location, looking inside the tent, looking out at the water. So again, looking out at the water, it was a very good match to the Pacific. And so we tried to frame as many shots looking out as we could. This is a harbor, a boatyard in Vancouver. The structures you see all existed. They were sheet metal, so we simply taking images, taking the building materials. You saw that other shot of the houseboat. We simply took the boards, the same red boards, wood, and we just changed the exterior. And again, we've added mountains in the background. So again, it was an existing building that we just retrofitted to make it match the locations. And this is the other view. Again, this was the view. We just added the mountains in the background to make the sense of it more of a cove in the Pacific Northwest. And this is the Marine Institute. This is a building we found also near Veneto. It's a modern art museum. And there's the left, there's a huge parking lot, and again, we've just added the mountains to make it seem like the same world. What we wanted to do is make sure that, since every one of our locations is pretty much near the water, is to try to give each of the water aspects a different feeling. So every time we're anywhere in Vancouver, we've added these large mountains. This is just, the big challenge was we're in 4 different labs around the world, one in Vancouver, one in France, one in Germany, one in Italy. So that we had to find something that was architecturally different for each of these. This was an abandoned warehouse that we went in and simply dressed. And this one we've used for Vancouver because we thought there was a good match between the structure inside and the structure outside. So, part of the story takes place on the Shetland Islands off the coast of Scotland. This is down in Puleo. If you've ever been to the Shetland Islands, you know it's a big outcropping of rocks. We have changed the landscape a little bit, but the lighthouse was an old marine station, and with CGI we've added the top of the lighthouse, but this is actually a location photograph. And again, it has a very different feeling. If when you're cutting from Vancouver to the Shetlands, you want to know instantly that you've gone to a different location. And this is a shed near a vineyard outside of Rome. And we found this empty location, and we decided it was a wonderful match for the interior of the lighthouse. It's all stone. It's completely different than what you saw in Vancouver. We brought in some dressing, and we felt that we were in this lighthouse. Another shot. I'm not sure you can see it. We did add the beginning of a circular staircase, suggesting that you were going to a second floor. This is a town in Puglia. And it looked a lot, we thought it looked the most like part of the French coast, a little bit south of Bordeaux, going towards Spain. And what we did is you'll see these buildings here with a Norman texture. We simply put facades on some of the stone buildings to give it a very specifically French feel. But this is pretty much, we've also changed, digitally we've changed some of the rooftops. Some of the rooftops in Italy are much flatter. But again, it had a perfect harbor, and again, it feels very different than the other locations. This is a fish market. It was actually the fish market in the town. And this is pretty much, except for some dressing, is pretty much as we found it. This is a lab in an infectious disease hospital in France. And this was a hospital we found outside of Rome that has been decommissioned. So that is, oh, sorry. Sorry. You're probably glad you haven't heard a lot of this. But anyway, is this working?
Yeah, great.
So this is a lab in a decommissioned hospital outside Rome. And again, we simply brought in this decontamination chamber. And again, the structure is very much as it was. So this is supposed to be about an hour outside of Oslo. And this is right, we went a little bit further on this. This is on the Italian-Austrian border. This is pretty much, we just did some establishing shots there. And the house is CGI and the 2 structures. Like this, we just set a second unit up with a double for one of the actors of the car. Again, this is something very different we hadn't seen before. We wanted to have the snow-capped mountains going down to the water. This is the offices of oil company, also in Oslo. And this was the Modern Art Museum in Rome. We took over this conference room. It looks out into a big parking lot, and we simply put a green screen there, and we're going to composite in. This is very temporary, but it will be looking out over the Norwegian coast as well. When I said that one of the things we were making a monster movie, and the monster was the water, so we decided even when you're inside a conference room like this, they're talking about what's going on in the world. We thought you actually see the water from this shot, Again, it's keeping the monster present. Did any of you see a very good series on Chernobyl? Yes. What was really fascinating about that, and I thought a lot about that, is that if you look at how many shots were by the reactor, it's probably maybe 10% of the time, but almost in every frame, the reactor had a presence. It was the sound, it was the score, and I thought that was a great example of how you keep the monster, the threat alive. And I thought also what they did, which was so brilliant, is that you didn't know what was score and what was sound effects. So partly the inspiration of this was the same thing. How do we keep the monster, the presence there? And we're going to do the same thing with the sort of the different sounds as well. But I think it's a very good example of how you can suggest a lot of things inexpensively if you're very clever about it. This is a scene that takes place in South Africa, outside of Johannesburg. There's an infestation of crabs that attacks. This is a beach we found an hour south of Rome, very rocky, like a lot of the beaches in that north of Johannesburg or Cape Town. And again, we've added mountains that are very specific to that part of the coastline there by CGI. This is the office in Tokyo, and we decided that this character, who is very much an Elon Musk character, and we wanted to make him and his presence very solid, so we decided to make every room he was very polished concrete. I don't know if you know the work of Tadao Eo or Kengo Kuma, the Japanese architects. They do things with cement that's absolutely unbelievable. The walls have a very beautiful texture. This is just a composite, and it will be a real shot of the Tokyo landscape at night. This is a ship in the last two episodes, and this is actually a part of the ship that we built on stages. The rest of it will be a combination of CGI, but again, we wanted to have at least some sections where you could interact with the water. This is the control room on the ship at the end, and this was all built in the studio as well. This is the same view of that as also. And I think, again, a lot of the money we had, the last two episodes take place on the ship in the Arctic. So a lot of the money we had saved on the other locations we put into building the ship. We were going to be there for 2 episodes, very complicated. So these are all different interiors. All of these were built on the stage in Rome. Yes, and this actually, this is the moon pool where basically small submarines are launched. And so we built this as well. And then once we were in this tank, we then went to Brussels to do all the underwater. But this again is all structure, which you can't quite see, but most of these pieces are modular. So it's a little bit like a Rector set. We simply took these pieces and recombined them for different parts of the other sets. We wanted everything was metal, the same gray, so it became very easy to take all the pieces and just reconstruct them to suggest different sets. This will be a CGI shot of the ship in the Arctic. Same, this is also part of the end sequence. Actually, no, I take it back. I'm sorry. This is actually, this is no longer in this film, so you can ignore this one. This is when the ship sank without being, it's in the novel, the ship sinks and goes down to the bottom intact, and we just decided we were getting too much into sort of fantasy sci-fi here, and so we have a version where the ship goes down, but it's torn to pieces. This is actually inside one of the submarines as it's being launched, and one of the characters inside. Also, we built this small submarine, which is not submersible, and I think that's a shot of the submersible leaving the ship. And this we actually shot in the tank in Brussels, and will be shot in the tank. Was shot in the tank in Brussels. And these are just some images from the end of which I won't give away. Yes, and this is actually the first time you're going to see actually what this creature looks like, which looks somewhat like this, but again, it's had a lot of incarnation since then. Thank you. Thanks, John. So again, the purpose of this exercise was to, this is what we put together when we had to go to all the broadcasters and saying, we feel that we can make this feel international. You don't necessarily have to be overly specific about which town, which area, but as long as you have a feeling that it's true to the worlds. And on the basis of this, they pretty much signed off, and it really saved us a lot of trouble with specificity. I mean, if you're getting these conversations about what's French or what's German or what's Italian or what's English, they can drive you to distraction because they become all about details, about windows and other structures. And our point was to show that we can create these worlds with the money we have by just suggesting them rather than being too specific about them. I think that's pretty much our presentation. So again, just to end, I think again, these projects are incredibly difficult to pull off, but I do think if you go into them, they can also be very freeing of your imagination, and you can be very adventuresome in some of the risks you take, and you just have to think differently. And again, I can honestly say that if I had done this for HBO or Netflix or the other people for whom I worked, it probably would have been a less interesting show. And certainly I think for the company, probably a lot less profitable, because again, we've managed to make this and maintaining rights in most territories except for the 5 that I mentioned, which is very difficult to do at this budget level. Jan, any final comments?
No, actually, you have touched all the main points. I would have as well, like all the other ones, like shooting location, timing issues. Obviously, like we could carry on for a long time, but all the other ones go more into technical and how we set it up, and then maybe another time.
Thank you. Questions?
Is it working with the mic? I thought it was.
Thank you very much. Sorry. Good.
Is Jan going? Is he?
Jan, would you like questions? I don't know.
Yeah, we will take.
So Jan, can you stay for some questions?
Did you say something to me? I couldn't hear you, Frank.
If he's going to stay.
Can you stay for questions?
Yes, but the sound quality was better before, but let's see. Yeah.
Questions?
Please, we have some. We need a mic.
Yes.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you for this very interesting introduction into this walk. We're looking forward to it. Please.
Oh. Hi, my name is Rebecca. I'm from the HFF student. I study production here in my second year, and I have a question for the financing process. You mentioned that the financing was only based on the pitching of the idea, and us, we are always told that we always need a letter of interest of a famous actor for the financing, but you didn't have an actor already who was interested to finance all the project?
Yeah.
Or?
Am I allowed to jump in, Frank?
Yes, please do.
And you say something afterwards, because like when we started the financing and you were saying you had this suggestion always already have an LOI from an actor, like the reason behind it is probably like to have already some significant popular on board. In this case, it was, first of all, we had 2 things which were very popular. The first thing was the IP, the Swarm, especially coming from Germany, everyone knew. And the second one was Frank Doelger. And that's why I said, can I answer? Because if we came into the room and said we want to do the Swarm, and we bring the producer from Game of Thrones, then it was a relatively easy pitch at this stage, to be said, yeah.
Relatively easy. That's the key. That's the key term. To answer your questions, it varies. Of the 4 projects that we have greenlit presently, not a single one has an actor attached. Again, my feeling was I wanted to sell them on the concept, but having said that, one of them is very expensive, and I know probably We won't get it financed without a big name, but that project, unlike the others, was written. There is a great part in it. Everything else we've done is pretty much ensemble. So we made a decision early on in this project that the writers came, there was a fantastic part, and we decided that we're not going to go further with that until we can get, in this case, a world-class actress for it. So, so again, big names sometimes make things easier.
And some of the deals were subject to. It was not, we didn't come into the room with big actors, but we started the negotiations, and they were always subject. For example, the whole Japanese discussion was like, they were interested, they liked the story, they liked the setup and the structure, but like putting substantial money on the table was subject to like an A-list name. So it was like a little bit the other way around. We didn't bring him, but they asked us to put him on the project.
Yes, in that case, they gave us a certain amount of money, and they doubled it if we could cast an actor on their approved list. Part of the problem is that, particularly now, it's so unbelievably competitive for everybody across the board. It's writers, directors, producers, below the line, actors. Even when I go to my own agency, and I ask to get material to talent they represent, I can't go with a money offer right now because I actually don't know how much money I'd actually have. So to try to get some of the actors, even people I've worked with, and the agents without actually quoting a figure is really, really tough because they have so many offers coming in. So I would, even on Game of Thrones at that point, we went in, the only actor anybody ever heard of was Sean Bean, and that was actually very much a decision to try to people with actors you hadn't seen before. So every project is different, and you can spend a lot of time. I know I have friends who are producers who spend 4 or 5 years trying to get things cast, to get them made, and that can be really soul destroying. So I wouldn't rely on that exclusively.
And one last comment from our experience, when we have other co-productions, maybe in a different structure, not with a Frank Doelger attached, we see it more and more, and so important to have already a writer, like a big name writer attached, or director. Like cast usually comes later. The partner on board then usually have a say on this anyways, but like having someone on the writing, because it becomes more and more important that, as Frank started, like the subject matter and how it is done, how it is written, that this position becomes more important than what we have seen in the past, to be honest, on the pitching level.
Thank you.
Thank you very much again for the great work. Just have 2 questions.
So first, wow. Yeah, I have 2 questions. First, what is your advice for the students that just graduated from school? I mean, both directors first, because I'm one, and producers. And the second one, how large is the chance for you to work with graduated students? And if yes, what depends on? Both of you, of course.
Let me answer the second question first. One of the things that's very exciting about being a producer is finding new talent, whether it's actors or writers, directors. Throughout my career, I've probably had first-time writers, or writers who have samples I've read, scripts never got made, directors who've had a student film. On certain projects, that's fantastic. And it's easier on series than it was certainly when I was doing individual films, it was tougher. But on series, when you're having 2 or 3 directors coming in per season, Game of Thrones, sometimes we had 4, and one year we had 5. Yeah, it's a wonderful opportunity to bring in someone, directors who, if the directors come in knowing that they have to match their style to what's already been established by the directors, it's a great place to get work. And I think one of the great advantages for young directors right now is there's so much more work out there. And if I wanted to direct right now, I would definitely try to find episodes of a show. I think when we were looking for directors for the Swarm, it was interesting. We met with 4 or 5 directors whose student films we liked enormously. None of them were available because they all had. The sad thing about it was they all had feature films that they were developing, and they were hoping to get financed. And so they walked away from the project thinking that it was better to stick it out and hope their films would get made. 3 years later, none of those films have been made. So whether you're interested in film or television, going on to a really good television series is a fantastic thing to have on your CV. So those opportunities didn't exist. They didn't exist certainly on this side of the Atlantic. So I would really recommend anybody seriously consider looking for episodes, getting yourself out there. Writers, the same thing. In the US, writers' rooms have been in existence for 20, 30 years. It's a comparatively new phenomenon here, certainly in the UK. On the Swarm, we had at different times 7 different writers on our projects now. It's a great training ground for writers as well. A lot of times we get writers who have just read samples that I like, and then I bring them into the writer's room, pair them with someone who's a bit more senior. And again, the number of, a lot of the writers that I've tracked that way, they now have their own shows. So there is a door that's open that was closed for a long time. And that was a door that really gave new talent a chance. So I would encourage you all to take advantage of the opportunities out there because it is a great time right now. I don't know how long this will last. Everybody feels that this bubble of insane number of projects getting made soon to pop. But yeah, I would definitely, that's where I would look. Jan, any comments on that?
No, I can't agree more. It's a time for talent at the moment. Maybe it always has been, but at the moment even more. Like everyone is hunting for it, and it's the same for us. If you look at Beta and Beta Group, they're very young companies. Some are even graduates from HFF Munich, and they have a very close look what's going on there, and obviously always trying to find good new projects, working with young people, bringing in a new spirit. And for the first question, because you asked like, what is our advice for students? Maybe one, because what I've seen in the last couple of years, maybe it doesn't always have to the first project in the market, not in that safe space in film school, like in after film school. It doesn't always have to be the biggest budget production, especially like more now talking on the production side, listen to the directors. So making the first step, I would say trying with a project which is suitable for that moment, and it can be creatively astonishing and it can be great. It doesn't have to be the most complicated one, because more important is that you actually get it on the ground and get it done and get connection to the broadcasters, and then it builds up. And because that's what I've seen a few times, that people had this huge, great creative ideas, and sometimes they were long developed and even brought from film school, and then they tried and then they kind of died on the way because maybe they were just a little bit too big for the first or second project. So I would do it step by step, and that may be one advice, one very concrete advice.
Okay.
From Israel.
My name is Omer. I'm a filmmaker from Israel, and I was wondering how much influence do directors have in this such of a project, like on the storyline and on the project?
On series of this sort, so I can answer from my own experience. One of the reasons that I do series is because they're totally producer driven. The feature films, the feature films I've done as a producer, you're in service to the vision of a director, which I found personally less satisfying. Series is completely producer driven. It has to be, because the exception may be that if you bring in a director for a pilot, and he or she will set the tone, the look, but even then, there's no one on a show, a series, there's no one directorial vision. There can't be. How do you, right now I have 3 directors working in the editing room on their episodes on The Swarm, and I'm going between them, trying to meld their visions, because you can't have my successful series, in my view, is like 1 8-hour film. So I don't want people to see directorial styles that are different between the episodes. But again, there's certain things that directors bring to it that only directors will bring with it. I never step in and work with the actors. I'm very involved in casting, but that's something that I leave to the directors. In terms of designing shots, that's definitely their decision. But in terms of the overall look, feel, everything that makes the series unique, it's very much what's put together, by myself or the other producers with whom I work. So again, and there are not a lot of directors out there who are really showrunners. A lot come in for a pilot or two, which is interesting to do and very profitable. But the majority of directors working in series are very much directors who are very good at coming in and shooting episodes. You're welcome.
Hi, my
Hi.
name is. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Hi, my name is Kirsten. I'm in the same class as Rebecca, so second year of producing here at HFF. And I have two. No, okay, great. I have 2 questions. My first one is how or how much was Frank Schätzing involved in the creative process?
Mhm.
And my second one may be a bit off topic, but when you've been asked why the last season of Game of Thrones was so bad, what did you answer?
They're both difficult questions. No, Frank Schätzing was quite involved, simply because when the rights were sold to the novel, there was a clause in his contract which said that there can be a television series made after a film is made. The film was never made, and therefore there had to be a new contractual arrangement. And I think he rightly felt that he had offered advice and been asked for advice and suggestions in the 14 years when it was developed, and I think he felt that no one really paid attention. And he decided that if he was going to have this made, he really wanted to be made capturing the spirit of the novel. So that was, it added a complication because again, you suddenly had writers dealing with an author. Famously, the first time I adapted a book, I was actually rather shocked. There was a book that I loved. We paid a lot of money for it, and I was meeting with the head of the studio at the time, and we sat with the writer, and the head of the studio said to the writer, "Read the book twice and throw it out." And I realized actually that was very good advice because the writer had to make it, had to be their own project. But Frank in the end was incredibly supportive. He completely embraced the idea that we had to reimagine it. I mean, this would have been more difficult if we were making this 2 or 3 years after the novel had been published, but everything has changed so radically in science, and he really loved the fact that we had changed the cast completely. The last season of Game of Thrones, in my opinion, was very simply that there's a huge problem right now, in my opinion, with visual effects. I always insisted visual effects report to the production designer because I just want the visual effects department and the production designer to be at the same ends. Visual effects departments, a lot of times, are just interested in cool shots. They have all these toys and they have a lot of money, they can play with it. And I think what happened a little bit is that last season we lost track of the characters. I think the characters basically became bit players, and they were just being moved around by visual effects. Having said that, there are people who loved it. It won lots of awards. There are a lot of people, I think, who felt that one of the things that made the show really interesting was the character dynamic, and I think that was, in my opinion, suffered because of that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Jan, any comments on Mr. Schätzing?
No.
We did actually. Yes.
The only because like the topic is challenges in international co-production, and if we focus on challenges, I would say it is like if you have a so well-known famous writer giving his novel to someone to make a series out of it, and it's the first one. It's a first time experience for him as well, and then you have a very strong creative lead on the series side. It's just something maybe from a structural part I would try to solve as precise as possible beforehand, because that solves a lot of issues on the way. Yeah. What the relationship is, who has to say, how the collaboration worked. That worked here very well because there was a lot of intention for compromising and on this side, but there's a potential for conflict, and to solve that conflict, I would recommend to do it beforehand.
One point on that, which is very important as well. Frank Schätzing and I would have discussions about certain plot points, and technically, he was coming to me because I had approval. And what Frank Schätzing didn't understand is that me having approval doesn't mean that I have approval. What it means that I have to navigate between all the people whose opinions I value and have to weigh in. Every decision that I made as a producer, and good producers make, is informed by the input of the writers and the directors and the cinematographers, everybody. And I said to Frank, there's not a single decision that we made that actually was unilateral. I would say what I would think, I would do for other people. So you have to understand that you're bringing me ideas, and I have to go back to the creative teams that are working on this. I simply can't say yes and do this. I can't dictate. Occasionally there'll be differences about casting, and then someone will have to weigh in. But again, the whole approval process on a series, particularly with you're asking about directors' roles and writers' roles, in a good series, it is very much collaborative. And also, all the information, the number of times the line producers would come and say, we can't afford something. And those were very valuable sessions because, again, we had to figure out ways to do things less expensively. So I think that's, again, and I think the interesting thing was that if you Frank Schätzing didn't understand that because he had never done it, but once you do it, you understand immediately that this whole idea of who has approval, again, unless you're with a director that has final cut, and even directors with final cut don't really have final cut, because again, the studios can wield a lot of power. So it has to be a collaborative process, and I always think it gives you the best result. Yes.
Hi, my name is Thomas, production at the HFF. Thank you very much for your time. It's been very inspiring. I would be very interested a bit more to learn about the development process. And you said you were working together with 7 writers, and how this worked in this writer room, and how you collaborated with the writers as a showrunner, and what your strategies and experiences were.
I mean, everybody does this differently. On this project, I thought it was really important to have different voices because of the different characters, and I wanted to put together writers that I thought would work very well together. And what we did was I worked with one writer on an outline, basically, because when you're going from a 900-page novel to an 8-hour miniseries, we had to really decide. It would be, if we just gave the novel to the writers, it'd be overwhelming. A lot of writers they need more direction. So the first step was really to try to distill the 900 pages down to 8 episodes, decide which characters we were going to drop. It was an editing process. Once we had that, we brought in 2 writers who were quite strong to write the first 2 episodes, and we went through a lot of drafts because, again, we kept hitting different roadblocks. Some were just financial. There were things that the writers wanted to do which we could never afford. Some were creative. Occasionally they had a different vision. They were going in directions that we didn't want. So partly what I was doing was I just tried to correct and edit as I go along. But interestingly enough, one of the things that was something in my experience was a huge shock to all of our partners. ZDF usually has every single script locked 2 months before you started shooting. And I said to them, we're going to be rewriting as we shoot, because in my experience, until you're cast, until you're on the set, this is not possible in a film, but on a series, until you're cast, until you're on the set, until you hear the actors speak the lines and play the roles, I think some of the best work comes out as you then start rewriting and reshaping. So I had 2 writers that worked alongside me while we were shooting, and sometimes we were delivering scenes 2 days before. And the directors really liked this, but I think some of the best work, certainly the best work I've ever done on the shows that I've worked on have been things that have been writing as you're going along. So the process is quite different, but in general, what I do is I'm primarily an editor, and then I also just try to shape everybody's visions, and at the end, again, probably bring in one writer who sort of smooths everything out as well. Does that answer your question, or is it? Okay, thank you.
I have a question. I'm Diana Ilgin, the head of Munich Film Fest and the FILMSCHOOLFEST, and thank you so much, and also to Elena and Bettina Heitz. Thank you so much to you coming here. It's really a very valuable afternoon. Thank you so much. I have a question. I don't want to keep others from continuing asking, but it's a little bit more a personal question. You're saying you're on projects for 12 years. Sometimes you've been on projects for many, many years. So, of course, we're all in for passion. Otherwise, we wouldn't do that. Would do other things. But how do you cope with this personally? Do you live in a forest or go for walks, or do you do yoga or have a dog? Or how do you keep track for 12 years? Because sometimes it's a very personal challenge too.
Well, the only time in my life I've done more than one series was on Game of Thrones. I've never wanted to repeat myself. One of the reasons that I decided after Game of Thrones to accept the job that was offered to me, this new company, was I realized I wanted to get back. I had never done this type of programming before, and I thought it was a new challenge. It's a real problem. I think that if I were a young producer right now, I would make sure that I didn't spend too much time on any one project. Game of Thrones for me, there are 2 reasons I stayed with it. One of which is that it was a new show every year, because all the worlds changed and the characters changed. And the other reason was actually quite different, is that I had a lot of friends, I knew a lot of people growing up in Belfast, whose lives had been ruined by the Civil War. And the film industry was a great hope for Belfast. When the film industry came into Belfast, it completely transformed the town. There was suddenly a whole industry that had never been there. There were thousands of people who were employed, painters who were out of work, carpenters, all of whom basically knew trade. We brought interns in over the course of the 9 seasons, the pilot of 9 seasons. They actually started a film program at Belfast University. There had never been one. Everybody in Belfast, Northern Ireland, who wanted to be in the film business had to leave because there was no work there. So I became very committed to seeing that industry grow. And I think, I was told that for every dollar, every pound we got from support from Northern Ireland, I think we generated £200 in income. So people's lives were changed, and students who were interested in the arts or in filmmaking suddenly had careers and could have careers in a town, in an area near their families that they loved. So I stayed with it. It was rewarding creatively. It was incredibly rewarding financially, which is not a bad thing at the end of your career, but it was really my commitment to seeing, creating something other than just a series. It was really watching. And it was fantastic because the last season, there were interns who were suddenly department heads. There were people who were camera loaders who were shooting things. So also, when I started, remember my first meeting? I think we had a big meeting. There were 400 people employed. 27 were women out of the 400. At the end, there was more women than men. So we completely transformed a completely male-dominated industry. And another way, when we started, this is something that's only important in Belfast. 80% of the people we employed were Protestants. By the end, it was an equal mix between Catholics and Protestants. So in a very small way, I felt that we were all helping to bring Belfast, giving Belfast a future it never had before. So that was the reason I stayed. How I kept my sanity, that's a subject for another conversation. Jan, any comments on?
I have a question. Because you just mentioned it, questions regarding diversity. Today's producers, they have to take care of that, right? We had a panel here about diversity. Tell us a little bit about it, because Frank, you know both worlds, because in the States, of course, and Canada, it's a different thing, I guess. Still.
Well, one of the things that was really admirable is that because except for Hulu Japan, our partners, they were all public broadcasters. And they have, for the first time, taken gender parity very seriously. It was always something that people aspired to, but they never demanded. In this situation, it was actually non-negotiable. We were told we had to do everything we could to have gender parity, to cast differently, and because it was a diktat, we were told we had to do it. We did it, and we took chances where we probably wouldn't have taken chances before, but it's something that is fantastic. I mean, and I think that's very much credit to the public broadcasters deciding that unless the producers are made to do this, they're not going to. So it's something that I think we were all incredibly proud of, and it's interesting because we're in post-production now between Munich and Berlin, and in my experience, I'll have a meeting with 10 people, and it's wonderful to be, two men in a room of 8 women, composers and post-production supervisors and the editors and the sound effects. It's a complete sea change from when I started my career. It's a more difficult for men right now for the first time, but it is wonderful. It's been a great step forward. Don't you agree, Jan?
Totally. And now I can hear myself twice. Yeah, you too?
No, you're sounding very clear.
Am I? Okay, no, but as you started as well, it was like a big demand from the financier and the broadcaster side, and I think it was quite organically how it worked together, and like from the experience you had before, and what they were asking for was not so difficult, to be honest. But they didn't just say it. It was a really demand on all, and it was not just on the creative level and the cast, through all the team. It was important to them, and it was gender and the new fancy topic, green production. They were very focused and asked for it, that we actually fulfill it. Yeah.
Yes.
Hello, my name is Maike Drienhausen. I'm a young producer at a company called Heimatfilm in Cologne. Thanks for being here and telling us stuff that we didn't know before. I've got 2 questions. The one is, you were saying that the Japanese Hulu came in quite late in the process. How did they come in at all? Like, how did you approach them? Who approached them? Did you pitch in markets? Did you know somebody? Or how did that work? And the second question is, you were saying that you rewrite, like from when you start to shoot, and you do rewriting. How does that work on the organizational side? Do you rewrite only in sets that are in locations that are already there, or does that mean that you have to reschedule and that the art team has to, or location managers have to find new locations for the day after the next day when you shoot, or how does that work?
So to answer the first question, it was a complete chance. 2 years ago, we were at the Berlin Alley, and an executive from ZDF Enterprises had been doing business or had been in correspondence with an executive at the head of Japan Hulu, and he had simply mentioned what we were doing. I was introduced to this gentleman. He asked to read the material, and then he said that he wanted to do it. And then we said fine, and how long was the negotiation? A year?
I just thought that's a short story. Like as I said, you met and he read the material and then he said he liked it and then we did it. And in between, I would say it's 1.5 years.
Yes, because we learned a lot about, but so it was a complete chance of a meeting. And I rarely ever go to events. I never go to screenings. I never go to the premieres of my own projects. So I was dragged there against my will, and now I'm being told I have to show up more often because of the things that happen. So rewriting, yes, you have to be realistic about it. First of all, which cast is available, when. You can't, actors who may have finished or have gone back, you can't bring them back in. It has to be either existing locations or the locations you can find. There was one scene that we came up with that it was at one of the labs. We had struck, the day before we had struck the lab, so the set was gone, but we found a beautiful stairway outside, so we simply moved it to the exterior. So there are a lot of factors, but the key thing is you need a director, a first AD, and a producer who say yes. Unfortunately, every time I went to them, they said yes, and they figured out how to do it. And it's interesting because the first time we did it, this was somewhat controversial because also I was shooting pages that the broadcasters hadn't seen, and they weren't happy about that. But it was a very small scene where, well, I'll tell you, the scene is about a woman who has to make a decision whether she goes off with this group of scientists or she is going to come back home and try to be reconciled with her ex-husband and take care of her children. And I just realized that we were shooting it. We didn't have a very satisfying moment. And so we wrote a scene where this woman is there and her husband comes in and she hands him over. She says, this is my will. This is the children's schools. There's doctors and everything else. And it was a scene about a mother. She was basically handing over the care of her children to her ex-husband because she needed to do that before she went away. And you also discover that the ex-husband, father of these children, one of the reasons he's estranged from his children, they separated when the children were 7 or 8. He admits to his wife he doesn't know who they are. They're suddenly teenagers. They never talk to each other, and he loves the children, but he's afraid. We shot this scene, and everybody on the set was crying. It was extraordinary. It was so moving. A great actress named Cécile de France. So we sent that out to all the broadcasters, and at that they stopped asking questions after that because we ended up with one of the. Now, the other thing I have to tell you about that, this episode was coming in short, and we had to deliver it 45 minutes, and I knew we were not going to get to 45 minutes, so I was also looking for scenes to add. So fortunately, it's the kind of risk that you take, and if you've got a very supportive team about it, it was great. And the only caveat was that a lot of the actors' English wasn't their first language, so at one point I think Cécile came to me and said, I love these scenes, but I need 2 days to learn them because the accent was an issue. So again, it's the kind of thing when you're doing a series like this, and if you have a very good team together and you know the material, great work can come out of it. Anything else? I think that's it then, yes, Laura?
Maybe we take one last question.
Sure.
Yeah, please. Otherwise, I will ask. Otherwise, I ask. So, some words of advice for the young talents here, because it's a changing market, and as you said before, there's so much production going on. So, and you are in a transition time between film school and entering the film industry. What would you two recommend from your heart to this young talent?
For directors, writers, and producers, all groups?
We have here a lot of directors also, I think, and writers, directors, but also producers, so maybe we can answer to all of them in a different way, maybe even.
Okay, so let me, I can just tell you how I've been approaching it with new talent. Producers, the key thing is just get in the door. I've had 4 fantastic assistants over the last Game of Thrones. I had 4 different assistants, all of whom are producing their own projects now. They all came from film school, and they came, and they're terrible jobs. You're answering the phones, you're doing everything no one else wants to do. You get a job as a production assistant, but I think the only way, I mean, unless you want to really, if you're going to be like with your own projects, you know, I think if you get a job with producers, with a production company, and you're good at it, you will rise very quickly through the ranks, in my experience. There are a lot of people who aren't good and they fall by the wayside, but if you have talent and you're hardworking, if you can get, as I said, I think almost any job that keeps you near around other producers, again, you will be, I mean, I think, Jan, you've had the same experience. Some of the people that I brought in a few years ago, we started the company, you've seen how they've really grown into the jobs. And as I said, that's what you have to do. I think that's, I mean, you might get lucky with your own projects. You might make it, you know, you might be working with directors and writers who can get some traction on a project too. But if you can't, definitely try to get any job you can. But hopefully working close to the other producers as possible. I've had a lot of people who've come in as interns, as volunteers, who you end up hiring as well. But there are not a lot of people out there who are good at that, and so there are possibilities for that. As I said, for writers and directors, I think, again, there are great opportunities right now for on-hand experience directing, writing, if you can jump onto an existing series. You know, wherever, and I don't think there's a country in the world which isn't seeing this kind of explosion in series television. So again, I think that's, for me, those doors weren't open before. So very simply, those are the things that I would suggest. I don't know enough about, I've never been in a position of trying to go out and get my own projects financed. I've always known how to go to, so I can't really give you advice on that. But I just think they're more practical. Well, you need the experience and you need to be introduced to people who can hire you again, who can finance your projects. Okay. Jan, anything to add?
Only it's such a great time at the moment for young talent because it's such a huge demand for content at the moment with all these new players we didn't have a few years ago, and there's still new players coming on the market, like all streamers from Disney, Apple, Netflix there for a longer time, HBO coming, HBO Max, from what we see, like usually these players, sometimes it's easier to get a first chance for something with them, or let's say the variety of potential partners is just so much bigger that at the moment, if you have great ideas, you work hard, you will get you a chance, I would say. It was much harder, like still a few years ago, where you had like more or less like the linear partners, and from our perspective, sometimes obviously like the young, like ZDF Neo and so, maybe you got a chance there, but usually they try to work with more established ones because it's a risk question for them as well. But since the competition is so high at the moment, I would say there is just great opportunities for talent, producers, directors, writers.
All right, thanks again.